cloud and mist across central and eastern areas. Where we've got low cloud and fog, it's going to feel chilly. Temperatures in the mid-single figures at best. Where we've got some sunshine coming through, western and northern parts of the UK, 9 to 12 Celsius, with light winds, pleasant enough. 1 or 2 showers could affect parts of Kent during Tuesday. Otherwise, for virtually everyone, it is dry. However, outbreaks of rain are edging into the far west of Northern Ireland by the end of Tuesday night, along with some cloud that will keep things milder here. But for many, it's another frosty and foggy night with a cold start to Wednesday. A battle between weather systems coming in from the west and high pressure to the east emerges midweek onwards, and that high pressure to the east this time will start to dominate. And that means that the early rain in the far west of Northern Ireland will tend to become weaker on and off, and perhaps a few spots of rain affecting the Western Isles. But otherwise, well, most places are going to be drier from Wednesday onwards. There'll be some showers coming in from the North Sea to affect eastern areas, but away from there, plenty of bright spells.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Friday and Sunday night from 9, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
We're on the same page again. There's something weird happening.
Let Ian finish. Don't be such a cranky.
That mini budget was the tip of the iceberg.
And on Saturday, my show just got bigger. From 8, it's Mark Dolan's Saturday Night In.
You can't govern a country if you can't speak.
Stop talking.
My God, we reached the end. I've never been early in my life. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and tune-in apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
And it's about standards and public life. No, I'll tell you what's hypocrisy, Narinda.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin.
We believe in the UK.
No bias, no censorship.
It just doesn't make sense to me. He wasn't doing his job as Chancellor.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton Tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News.
Well, hello there, it's 6 o'clock, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and this is Dewbs and Kerr, the show where we'll get into some of the things that have got you talking today. Now, did you notice some of the front pages here in the UK today were dominated by the goings-on in China? What were those goings-on? Mass protests right up and down the country. Why? Well, this whole thing that I would call nonsense, actually, the zero-COVID strategy. Are you someone that celebrates such a thing, or are you like me and think that they are now way over and above beyond the point of abusing people's human rights? What then should the UK government do, if anything at all? I want your thoughts on that. And net zero, we're all familiar with this by now, aren't we? But should we be? Should this be a target that we are so obsessive about reaching? Many people say not. A poll out today says 44% of the UK want a referendum on whether or not we should still be going headlong into net zero. Quite frankly, I'm surprised it's as low as that. Where do you sit on it? And private schools, that whole thing, politics of envy. That's what I call those people that try and remove things like their charitable status. The latest one to focus on that today is Sir Keir Starmer. He wants to stop them having what he calls the VAT loophole, take that money and put it into the state school sector instead. Is he right, or are you like me and just think, pack it in with your politics of envy? Tell me your thoughts on all of that, but now let's get ourselves up to speed with tonight's latest headlines.
Thank you, Michelle. This is the latest from the GB newsroom. More than 50 Conservative MPs have signed a letter urging the Prime Minister to introduce emergency legislation to ease the migrant crisis. They want modern slavery laws changed so that people are returned to safe countries faster. They also say those who claim they've been trafficked should be sent back without objection. Signatories, including Sir Graham Brady and Esther McVeigh, believe it would deter people from crossing the Channel. GB News understands almost 450 people have been intercepted on 9 small boats so far today. The letter's author, MP David Davis, says the change would mean migrants could be sent home within days of arriving.
So if we got the gumption to do it with all new arrivals from a safe country, I don't mean from Syria or Afghanistan where they may have a claim, but from a safe country, then frankly, it should knock out almost all of the 12,000 a year that we're looking at the moment.
The government's considering asking the armed forces to stand in for hospital staff during possible strikes this winter. Health officials are drawing up contingencies to cover frontline workers as ambulance drivers and paramedics consider joining nurses in their upcoming walkouts. The Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, says they're concerned about the impact the action could have on patients.
Well, no formal request has been made by the Department of Health to the military, but of course we will look as part of our normal contingency plans at a range of options. The priority for me is to continue the dialogue with the trade unions, with the RCN. I've been extremely clear that my door is open. They have raised a range of issues, not just pay, but also about working conditions, patient safety, and so I'm very happy to continue that dialogue.
The Foreign Secretary is backing the right to peaceful protests in China over COVID restrictions. Protesters turned out again this evening, despite a strong police presence. It follows demonstrations over the weekend which started after 10 people were killed in a fire at an apartment block. Protesters blame quarantine measures, saying they prevented the victims from escaping. James Cleverly says the Chinese government should take notice of these rare protests.
It is rare that the Chinese people protest publicly like this. They know the risks. In fact, some of the protesters are saying they know the risks, but it's something they feel incredibly strongly about. And as I say, because they are a rarity, I think that both the international community should take notice, but more importantly, the Chinese government itself should listen to what the Chinese people are saying to them.
National Grid has decided not to introduce its energy savings scheme tomorrow, paying households if they cut power usage. The move would have been the first ever live run of the operator's demand flexibility service, designed to ease pressure on the country's energy grid and avoid blackouts. The government's launching a £1 billion scheme to make middle-income homes more energy efficient. The 3-year scheme will see hundreds of thousands of homes receive loft and cavity wall insulation from the spring. Households that don't currently get support to upgrade their homes will be prioritised, whilst a fifth of the funding will be set aside for the most vulnerable. Business Secretary Grant Shapps told us the measures will help households reduce their energy consumption.
This £1 billion, which is in addition to a lot more money that's been provided previously, is to allow anyone in any kind of housing, could be private rent, it could be their own home, could be social housing, to improve the property in order to make sure that it meets those higher standards. And that will save people, quite a lot of money.
Shadow Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds told GB News Labour wants to insulate 19 million homes as soon as possible.
It's about 10 years too late. I mean, this should have been a quick early win for the government, reducing people's fuel bills and doing the right thing by the environment. I mean, it's a win-win. Why has it taken so long? This government have neither the ambition or the direction. Of course, I welcome when they come a little bit onto our territory, whether it's a windfall tax or greater energy efficiency ambition, but they've got nowhere near the comprehensive programme they need to get this country onto the right path.
And the Prime Minister has switched on the Christmas lights at Downing Street this evening as part of an annual tradition. A warning, the following contains flashing images.
2, 1.
Well, earlier today, the First Lady of Ukraine hung ornaments on the tree with the Prime Minister's wife. Elena Zelenska is expected to address MPs and peers tomorrow as part of her visit. TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now it's over to Dewbs & Co.
Thanks for that, Tatiana. Well, I'm with you right through till 7 o'clock this evening, keeping me company here in the studio. My panel, we've got the writer and the broadcaster, Matthew Stadlen, and Toby Young, who's the director of the Free Speech Union. And you guys know the drill, don't you, on Dewbs & Co? It's not just about us here and our thoughts, it's about you at home as well. What's on your mind tonight? Get in touch with me. gbviews@gbnews.uk is the email, or you can tweet me at gbnews. Lots of you have been getting in touch already. I was asking about the whole China thing. Many of you, Lisa is just one example, saying that we should stick basically here, focus our attention on what goes on here in this country, not keep poking our nose into the business of others. That is a sentiment that is echoed from many, many of you on the net zero thing. Lots of you are saying referendum was one of the emails I've just got. I quote that exactly. Peter, you say net zero should be something that's listed in the manifestos of all political parties in the next election, and that then would indeed be the next referendum. It was, by the way, in the manifestos of many parties back in 2019. I suspect there are many people, probably myself included, if I'm honest as well, we don't read absolutely everything, do we? So I do think many people didn't realise just how much net zero stuff was contained within those manifestos. I'm asking you then, do you reckon we do need a referendum on whether or not we should be gung-ho to net zero or not? Susan says, Michelle, welcome back. We've missed you. I've missed you too, Susan. Thank you very much. I have indeed been on holiday. I've got myself right into the festive spirit when I was gone. My Christmas decorations are fully up. Are yours? Are your decorations up, Matt?
Not quite yet. My wife had her way. They'd have been up in September.
Oh, I love your wife. Are yours up, Toby?
Not yet.
Not yet. These are the important questions I like to get the heart of, ladies and gentlemen. Are your Christmas decorations up yet? If not, what are you waiting for?
I've got a question,
What?
which you might want to ask the viewers, which
Go on.
is, given that we're in the throes of an energy crisis and given the price of electricity, are we going to be as lavish this year about putting up lit-up decorations outside our homes?
It's funny you should mention that, because I had this very conversation with my mum. There are certain houses that I can think of in certain places that I won't mention, and they're lit up like Blackpool illuminations. And half the time I think, well, where do you get your money from for all those decorations? But that is the key question. Let's ask it to the viewers. Have you someone that's your front garden does reflect or represent something like a Blackpool illuminations? And are you doing that this year? Have you got one of those houses near you? And are they doing it this year or not? Some of the houses, by the way, I think they look absolutely awful. They look like you've got a Christmas catalogue, shaking it all up with a bit of glue and stuck it in with no thought or considerations to what it is that you're trying to create. Send me some pictures, by the way, of your Christmas decorations if you want.
One of
we
the
can
big
get all
questions,
technical.
by the way,
What?
about when to start with your decorations is how long for the tree. So if you start too early, the tree dies, and then you have to get another tree and do it all over again, which some people might enjoy, but not for me.
Or you can just get an artificial one and dust it off and keep it year after year after year.
No.
My mum got one of those narrow ones, real small, narrow, artificial tree, and we all laughed at it, and she's never put it up again since. Anyway, I massively digress. I'm not supposed to be talking about Christmas decorations. I'm supposed to be talking about what's going on in China. Have you seen lots of it? If you're on social media, you will have seen much content. If you're reading the newspapers today in the UK, you will have seen it here as well. What am I talking about? All the mass protests taking place at the moment. Quite unexpected, many people will say. I'm showing you on the screen now some of the front pages of the UK newspapers this morning. Many of these protesters, by the way, calling for President Xi Jinping to resign. This whole zero COVID, I call it a nonsense because I think it is. I think it's like you're trying to catch wind in your hands and stop it. It's not going to happen. Where do you think... In fact, actually, let me just rewind. The UK, should we have... You can tell I've been on holiday, can't you, everyone? I'm in holiday mode still. I'm just doing whatever I want. Sorry to my director. The UK... I personally think there's so many abuses now of human rights going on in China. Should we be getting involved and interfering or not?
Well, it's a really good question, and it's not just because of what's happening in China that our minds are being focused. It's because of what's happening in Qatar, the fact that the World Cup is being held there. And I made some comments the other day about the Saudi king. I think he was suggesting there would be a day's national holiday because Saudi Arabia beat Argentina. I said, how about stepping aside and facilitating democracy? And I then got a big backlash, perhaps unsurprisingly, from a lot of Saudis on Twitter saying, stick your noses out of our country, and then posting examples of our own abuses of human rights, and as they would see it, the abuse of Iraq because we invaded Iraq. So it's a real minefield. On China calls itself the People's Republic of China. It's no such thing. It's an autocracy. I'd call it a dictatorship. Xi Jinping is a very bad man. And what they are doing to people in China habitually are very bad things. And as someone who supported, because I thought at the time that's what the science supported, someone who supported lockdowns here in this country, for me, what they're doing in China is going way beyond that. It's believed that some people died in a fire in one of those provinces in China because they were locked into their homes from the outside. And that is absolutely disgusting. So should we as a country get involved? Well, you heard our Foreign Secretary James Cleverly just there say that the world should take notice. He was quite measured in his language. The difficulty for us is that, A, lecturing other people on COVID responses is tricky because of our own COVID responses. But B, we have, I just looked it up, £90 billion of trade basically every year, including imports and exports with China. So if we're going to do business with them, should we be lecturing them?
Well, indeed, that is $1 million question. Should we, you tell me at home, should we be lecturing them, involving ourselves in their business or not? Where do you stand on it?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, and the conflict is between how far do we defend and urge other countries to defend universal human rights, and how far do we respect other countries' right to national self-determination? And I think in this case, clearly, the universal human rights of the people being imprisoned in their homes in China in pursuit of a policy we know doesn't work clearly trumps China's right to national self-determination, and James Cleverly should be speaking out and should be highlighting these human rights abuses in China along with all the other human rights abuses in China. But I think the really interesting thing here is that zero COVID, which is the policy that President Xi has been pursuing relentlessly in China in a way which we weren't able to here, but some members of our government wanted to, like Jeremy Hunt, and he should have to answer questions about that, I think, given we've seen how appalling people are treated in pursuit of this fairyland goal of zero COVID. But it's clear that it doesn't work. And if zero COVID, if locking people in their homes in the most draconian way, boarding people up in their homes, having policemen deliver meagre supplies to them until they become free of the disease, even if they're just suspected of having it without having tested positive, if that doesn't work, it sends a pretty clear message to the rest of the world that ordinary lockdown policies don't work either. If zero COVID doesn't work, what hope do less draconian lockdown policies have of working? So I think we should tell China, your policy's not working. You should abandon it. If it did work, it wouldn't have the largest outbreak in its history right now, with 40,000 people tested positive in the past.
It's very interesting what you say, Toby, because I'm absolutely against literally locking people in their homes. And I was obviously very...
Where's your line there?
So it's a really interesting question, because Toby says that lockdowns we now know don't work. Well, I'm not advocating the sort of lockdown that's going on in China where you are literally locked into your homes and people have not left their homes for 100 days. It's disgusting, right? And it's emblematic of the sort of regime that I've already described China as being. Do we know that lockdowns in this country didn't work at all? We know that they didn't completely suppress the virus. Absolutely. Most of us have got it at one point or another. I had it and so forth. But do we know that they didn't help a little bit when the health service could have been on its knees? I'm not sure we know that. And should we know that? Should we look into that? We don't necessarily need a public inquiry because that could be a huge expense.
We do.
But should we investigate it? So next time there's a pandemic, we are acting in the best possible way for all of us.
Well, lots of people are investigating it, and there have been plenty of research studies done by scientists, economists and others suggesting that the policy is largely ineffective. And we have the evidence that, Sweden, which didn't lock down at all in 2020, now has a lower number of excess deaths
Different
than other
demographic,
European
of
countries
course.
which did lock down.
Different circumstances.
True of Florida, true of Nicaragua.
Oranges and limes.
But I think that the failure of the zero COVID policy to prevent infection in China is yet more evidence that the lockdown policy is largely ineffective. Because if it's ineffective when imposed that extremely, how can we think that it's effective if it's imposed in a less
Except in China, and this I think is an important point, because I'm being absolutely clear, I'm not advocating what they are doing to people in China. Absolutely not. However, is it working though, Michelle? Is it working? They've had far fewer deaths, have they not, than in lots of other countries?
Are you telling me? I mean, I think their official death registers is about 5,000 deaths or
not
something like that.
Not saying we should believe
it,
but if it's true, if it is, Michelle, if it is true, then you could argue, at least intellectually or philosophically, on one level, it is working. The reason it doesn't work, to my mind, is because you can't live life like that. You can't simply lock cities down for hundreds of days because it's barbaric.
I think people have lost their marbles when it comes to this whole COVID situation, and they've become so silo-focused in on how do you prevent the spread of COVID. And in doing so, they've completely overlooked pretty much anything else. All of the unintended consequences. I accept that if you want to lock people down, most of the time you might think you're doing the right thing, I might dispute it, but you probably do it with good intentions. But if you look at everything that goes on and around, the damage, the impact that you are doing on people's mental health, their ability to go and provide for their family, their education, their physical health, it's absurd that people zero in just on preventing COVID.
It's not, but Michelle, it's important, and I know we're rehashing some of the old arguments, and that's why I say we should be properly investigating this, and I think Toby agrees with me on that. It wasn't simply about avoiding people getting COVID because COVID was seen as some particularly awful disease. In this country, the policy, to my mind, was very clear. It was about ensuring that our health service did not collapse under the weight of COVID infections. Did we get that right? I don't know, because I'm not researching it, but we do need to find the answer. It is collapsing now. You're right, it is.
People predicted in Sweden, COVID lockdown zealots predicted that if they didn't impose a lockdown in 2020, the Swedish health service would be overwhelmed. Similarly in Florida, when Ron DeSantis, as the governor, lifted restrictions in the summer of 2020, widespread predictions amongst the lockdown enthusiasts that soon the Florida health service would be completely overwhelmed. It wasn't overwhelmed in Sweden, it wasn't overwhelmed in Florida. So I think that argument that the NHS was at risk of being overwhelmed if we didn't lock down in March 2020...
And although Britain, as I said earlier, is different from Sweden, and I'm sure it's different in lots of ways to Florida, that, on the face of it, suggests that there is evidence that maybe lockdowns are not necessary. And that's why, as someone who called for lockdowns, along with a lot of other people who felt that we were going along with science, and remember, policy was being made on the hoof in what was actually a national emergency, that's why I now am honest enough to hold my hands up and say, I don't know still whether or not they were the right policy.
Therefore, we need to make... disagreed with things like lockdown and restrictions at the time?
I don't abuse anyone. I argue with them, and I hope I argue with them politely. If they try and bully me and pile on Twitter, I will fight back robustly, but I would not say I abuse people.
Because this is the thing that this is one of the things that really annoys me, that when we was in the thick of this whole COVID thing, and it still goes on now, by the way, anyone who dared to have a view that we didn't need to be locked down, that every single person in the land didn't need to be injected more times than I don't know what with these vaccines, if you dared to have a different view, the abuse that you received, people were saying that you shouldn't be allowed to go to the hospitals in this country if you were ill, if you weren't vaccinated.
Completely
wrong.
I think it's
I
never, ever suggested that. And you're right, there was to some extent a herd mentality, and that was given extra power because the science seemed at the time to suggest that was the right direction to take. But actually, and again, I'm going to hold my hands up, I think the fact that certain people on GB News, and I'm not a fan of conspiracy theories at all, but certain people on GB News questioned the majority view, I don't think that is unhealthy. I think to an extent it is healthy because ideas need to be challenged.
It's not healthy to an extent.
It's healthy. It's
healthy, full stop.
OK, Michelle, it's healthy until you get to the point where people start arguing that we are being injected with vaccines because the state wants to control us. That's unhealthy.
But do you not think, I'll open this to you, because one of my theories in all of this for a very long time it wasn't just about, and I think this in China, by the way, which is why I'm talking about it now, it wasn't just about let's follow the science and do all these things. Some of these things are absurd. They're absurd. I mean, you can go to a pub. I always remember being shouted at in a pub, Toby, no vertical drinking, no vertical drinking. I was like, what are you even talking about? And I'd had the audacity to stand up with a drink in my hand. I could sit down with a drink in my hand, but I couldn't stand up, no vertical drinking. And I think you lot aren't trying to suppress COVID. You're trying to control me to the nth degree of my life, and I don't like it. I didn't like it. I don't like it now.
No, and I think you're right that one of the reasons those absurd policies remained in place for so long is because there was a kind of soft suppression of debate. If you dissented about all the COVID restrictions that were in place, you were accused of being a granny killer, of placing profits before people, of not being compassionate, not caring enough. And that became very inhibiting for a lot of people. And a lot of people who did, have doubts about the wisdom of those restrictions felt very isolated. That's one of the reasons I set up what was Lockdown Skeptics and is now The Daily Skeptic, to provide a kind of a hub, a safe space, a place where people could air those doubts, have proper grown-up discussions about the wisdom of the policy response to the pandemic without fear of being cancelled or shamed in some way. And believe me, it's still going on. Today, I got someone contacted me who is under investigation from the regulator of his profession because he published a piece challenging the wisdom of the lockdown policy. So it's not as if that soft suppression is over. People are still at risk of losing their jobs, undergoing fitness to practice hearings and the like, just for challenging the wisdom of the lockdown policy, even today, when I think we know that it's perfectly reasonable to express reservations.
Michelle, just to come back on and I think I broadly agree with you on that, but one of and this is an example of, by the way, why it's so healthy to have these sorts of conversations in real life and on television rather than just on Twitter, because I'm sure if Toby and I just interacted on Twitter the whole time, we'd probably disagree with most things. But Michelle, you suggested that they, whoever they are, presumably the government and the Conservative government, were trying to control us to the point where they weren't letting us stand up or sit down or whatever it is. And that's where I take umbrage, because that, to me, is a conspiracy theory. Because if you look back at Boris Johnson, I was no Boris Johnson fan. I wanted him to... I called him out the entire time, as most of my followers on social media would know. He's basically, if he's anything, a sort of libertarian at heart, I think. The idea that he wanted, and we know this from some of the things that he's supposed to have said behind the scenes, the idea that he wanted to lock us down, that he wanted Michelle Dewbs not to be able to stand up and drink her pint, to me is pie in the sky. He hated imposing those restrictions.
Well, you take umbrage at me saying that they wanted to control us. I'll double down on that. I don't just think it was the government. I think so many people were complicit in it. I think a lot of the UK media. I certainly think a lot in the government. You mentioned Boris Johnson as a sole individual. He was
the Prime Minister.
Well, yeah, and you mentioned him. And if you remember at the start of a lot of this, he was very relaxed about everything. He used to say, wash your hands. He would shake hands, all the rest of it. But then many people in and around him got to him. They got to him and were very effective because people were not able to challenge. You say, oh, we followed the science. But what science? Because there was an awful lot of scientists, a lot of experts, a lot of specialists who know their onions that were suppressed.
But what was the motivation for locking us down, Michelle? Why do you think these people around Boris Johnson, these shadowy figures, wanted to lock us down?
Well, I personally think there's two reasons, actually. I think that there's this whole notion of people just like to control people, and you might say that's a conspiracy theory. I think that's absolute, total truth and common sense. I think people get a kick from saying, you can sit down and have your drink, but you can't stand up and have your drink. I think people like it.
What, pub landlords wanted that? Pub landlords would have been some of the people who have been screaming that this is awful, that we shouldn't be locked down, that we shouldn't have these sorts of regulations, surely.
Well, I think I'm absolutely right, and I think you asked what the other motive was.
Do you agree,
I
Toby?
think things like profit motivations of lots of these pharmaceutical companies.
I think you've located the kind of area of disagreement in the wrong place with respect. I don't think there's any question that the government and public health authorities wanted to control our behaviour during the 3 lockdowns that took place in this country.
But not for the sake of controlling our behaviour.
The issue is, why did they want to control our behaviour? Was it because they actually believed it would reduce transmission, reduce the burden on the NHS and so forth? Did they actually believe it was in the public interest, or did they have another agenda? And I think they did believe it was in the public interest, but I don't think because they thought it was in the public interest, that entitled them to suppress debate about the policy. And I think there should have been more debate about it, and they should have lifted those restrictions sooner than they did, and they would have done had there not been this kind of unbelievably zealous attempt to suppress dissent in all its varieties. And I think the government was wrong there, and they overreached there. And it was the greatest interference in our liberty in this country's history. Maybe they did it. You know, I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt and say they were acting in good faith. They were trying to protect the public, but that's only because they didn't have they weren't exposed to the alternative point of view. There was no one red-teaming the advice they were getting from Sage. There should have been a much more open discussion about it all.
Well, there you go, and there wasn't much open discussion about it at all, was there, except perhaps on GB News. Right, we can continue that conversation, we perhaps will in the break, but I do have to go to a break. When I come back, I want some of your responses to that, and I want to talk to you about net zero. Do you think there should be a referendum about Britain's obsession, or should I say the government's obsession, with achieving our net zero targets? Tell me your thoughts, and I'll see you in a couple of minutes.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you know, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Friday and Sunday night from 9, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
We're on the same page again. There's something weird happening.
Let Ian finish. Don't be such a cranky. That mini budget was the tip of the iceberg.
And on Saturday, my show just got bigger. From 8, it's Mark Dolan's Saturday Night In.
You can't govern a country if you can't speak.
Stop talking.
My God, we reached the end. I've never been early in my life. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
And it's about standards and public life. No, I'll tell you what's hypocrisy, Narendra.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin.
We believe in the UK.
No bias, no censorship.
It just doesn't make sense to me. He wasn't doing his job as Chancellor.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton Tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News.
Hello there, welcome back to Dewbs & Co with me, Michelle Dewberry. I can tell you that debate between my panel tonight, the writer and broadcaster Matthew Stadlen, and Toby Young, the director of the Free Speech Union, did indeed rumble on throughout the break. Do tell me your thoughts on the whole lockdown COVID thing. Nigel said, oh, stop talking about COVID, move on, Michelle. No, I won't move on, because I always worry, you know, that we could just have another spike or a wave, whatever you call them these days, just around the corner. So I think having conversations about how indeed we should react to them is essential in my mind. Anyway, by the way, lots of you sending in your Christmas tree pictures. I appreciate it. Enid, I've got your Christmas tree. I love it, in particular a Christmas pudding decoration. I like that. And I like your chairs. Stephen, you don't have your Christmas tree up, but you have actually sent me a picture of your kebabs instead. That's not a rude thing. That is indeed. You've sent me your kebabs. I appreciate it. It's made me hungry. Let's talk about net zero, shall we? Where do you stand on this whole issue? A poll by YouGov now shows that 44% of adults in Britain support the idea of a national referendum on whether or not to continue with the whole net zero thing. 27% oppose the idea and 29% said they didn't know. To be honest, Matthew, I was quite astonished. It was only 44% said that they are in favour of this referendum for net zero. Are you?
I'm definitely not in favour of a referendum for net zero.
Why not?
First of all, I don't think we should govern, or our country should be governed by plebiscite. Can you imagine if we have to rerun the sort of toxic debate that we endured for the Brexit referendum every month, or possibly every week? Because where do you start and where do you stop with this? The second argument I have, and you might say it's in contradiction to the first, is that this is such an important area that we shouldn't entitle ourselves to become experts in it and decide our future directly. We live in a system of parliamentary democracy. We live in a system of representative democracy.
Do you think we're too thick?
No, I don't think we're too thick, but we're too busy trying to keep our homes warm because they're not insulated. We're too busy being plumbers or television presenters or whatever it is to devote the sort of resources required really to understand these things properly and responsibly. What we do have is general elections. We elect our MPs. We all get the opportunity to elect our MPs. Now, they admittedly are not experts, but they have a responsibility to become sufficiently expert on every given issue that they are in a better position than those they represent, us, the people who vote them in, to come up with the sorts of decisions we hope they get right. Now, of course, I don't think MPs get everything right. Obviously not. But we have a system where our MPs legislate on our behalf, and sometimes where the government legislates through its executive powers. This is such an important issue, and I think it should be in the hands of MPs, and there is broadly a consensus across the political parties which tells you something. And what it tells me is that the science is almost certainly right, and we're moving in the right direction. And the very final thing, and that is that the idea that net zero is somehow going to harm us seems to me to be wrong. Because first of all, there are all sorts of business opportunities for people to make money and build the economy in the transition to net zero. And secondly, if you think about reducing fumes on the roads, reducing cars, that's going to make our air cleaner, that's going to make your son, my son, healthier. If you think about insulating our homes, it's going to mean that we spend less money. So the idea that net zero is some big bad wolf that is coming here to eat us all up, I think is completely wrong.
Toby, where do you stand on it?
Yeah, I'm very much in favour of a referendum. I mean, it almost sounded as though Matthew was saying that because the policy is clearly the right policy, people shouldn't have a choice about whether to embrace it or not. It should be just imposed upon them because it's for their own good and for their children's good. I don't buy that argument. I think, of course, we shouldn't have referendums about everything, but I think where an issue affects everyone in a really profound, far-reaching way for decades to come, like whether or not we should be in the EU, then there should be a referendum about it. And, you know, one of the reasons fuel bills are going to be higher this winter, not the only reason, but one of the reasons is because of the net zero policy. There's a story in the Telegraph right now, I checked just before coming on air, saying that some rural homeowners could be forced to spend £13,000 on heat pumps because net zero rules will cause traditional heat systems to be banned. You know, there's going to be a ban on the sale of petrol and diesel-driven cars, new cars, from 2030. These are incredibly far-reaching changes that are going to affect
of job opportunities, so you can all get a better, well-paid job to help you pay you, whatever it was you just mentioned.
Yeah, well, so far those jobs haven't really materialised, and nothing like to the extent to compensate for the cost to the economy of pursuing this particular policy. And, you know, I don't think it's enough to say that it was in the manifesto of the Conservative Party in 2019. I mean, we'd already embraced net zero by then. It was already passed as an act of Parliament.
We have enough time to debate referendums, but not enough time to read the manifestos of the Labour Party and the Tory
Well, the problem
Party.
is, Matthew, that if it's one policy amongst many in a manifesto, I don't think and it doesn't get voted for by, you know, over 50% of the population, you can't then say, well, people have consented to paying £13,000 to replace
why not have a referendum on policing?
Boiler with a heat pump.
Sure, but why not have a referendum on policing? That affects us all. Why not have a referendum on how much we should be taxed? That affects us all. Why not have a referendum about how much exactly you should put into the NHS?
Why not?
Well, I think one of the reasons
we don't have the time for it. That's why we have MPs.
One of the reasons we should have a referendum on this issue and not some of those other issues is a point you made earlier, which is that all three main political parties agree on this policy. So there really isn't a choice at the ballot box about whether to pursue net zero or not, which means there should be a referendum about it because we can't express our views at the ballot box.
Even though only 44% of people in this YouGov poll, which, by the way, was sponsored by Car 26, which I think is fair to say would disagree with me about almost everything on the environment. Only 44% of people, as Michelle expressed her surprise already, actually want to have a referendum.
Nearly 30% said they weren't sure.
Yeah,
So
I
they
think if you
didn't say
factor in the
no.
don't knows,
Yeah.
then it's a majority.
You need to have, surely, if you're going to have a referendum, you at least have to have a majority of people wanting the referendum in the first
But I
place.
guess you would say to you the same about people who opposed a referendum over our membership of the EU. If you're so convinced that this is the right policy, then why not make that argument in the public square? Why run scared of a referendum?
If we were to have a referendum, it's obviously out of my hands, I would continue to try to be invited on shows like GB News to make my arguments as powerfully as I can. Toby, you care so much about education, rightly,
yes.
that you set up a school, right? Am I right?
Yes.
Wouldn't it be wonderful to live in a world where our children can breathe fresh air? And by the way, I'm not going to set myself up as some sort of Jesus figure on this. You could easily accuse me of being a hypocrite. I still drive my car. I still eat more red meat than I should. I do all the sorts of things that you two probably do that, in my view, we should do less of. I'm part of the problem. I'm not saying I'm holier than thou or I'm virtue signalling. I just think that the science suggests that if we drive fewer cars, if we drive cleaner cars, if we eat
But then
less
why don't you
meat,
drive a
if we
cleaner
do
car
all
then
those
and do
things,
all those things?
partly because it's expensive. And I hope that it can be made less expensive.
It's not
But as I
expensive.
say,
It's not expensive
as
to
I
eat
say,
less
I'm
red meat.
by no means perfect, and I'm part of the problem. Doesn't mean I can't see the intellectual arguments for doing it.
And let me just pick up. I just want to pick up this point about toxicity, because you referenced at the point, your first response, you said, "Oh, we don't need like more of this toxic debate." I would argue, actually, the only reason it was toxic is because people were not able to accept the result and the response.
It was toxic before.
So what
that, wasn't it?
happened?
Before the result.
Was it really?
I thought you said, you know, if you believe in education, why are you in favour of this referendum? It's a slightly bizarre argument, but one of the reasons I'd like there to be a referendum on the net zero issue is because I do believe in education, and I think a public debate in which people like you and I thrashed it out on GB News would be educational. I think people were educated by the Brexit debate. Yeah, there were some toxic elements to it, but as Michelle says, a lot of the toxicity occurred after the result.
So on the substance, if we were to have a referendum...
Well, we're going to come back to the substance because I've been told off. I do need to go to a break. I'm going to go to a break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about the substance of what would a referendum look like. If you say, yes, Michelle, could be a referendum, you tell me what should be the question that's on it then. What do you want to ask? And I want to ask you about private schools. Should there be charities? Should you not have to pay your 20% VAT on the school fees? According to Keir Starmer, the answer to that is no. Get rid of the charity status. Do you agree with him? Yes or no? I'll see you in a couple of minutes.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dewbs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
Why not take us home with you by visiting the GB News shop at gbnews.store? You'll find all the official merchandise, a really good present actually for yourself, your friends or your family.
We ship across the UK mainland at no extra cost. GB News, the People's Channel.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Monday to Thursday, 10 till 12, on TV, on radio and online.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Hello there, welcome back to Dewbs & Co with me, Michelle Dewberry, keeping you company till 7 o'clock tonight. Alongside me, we've got the writer and broadcaster Matthew Stadlen and Toby Young, who's the director of the Free Speech Union. Just before the break, in case you've just tuned in, we were debating whether or not we should have a referendum about the UK's obsession, shall we say, with net zero. Many people writing in and saying, absolutely, yes, you should have a referendum. So I put it to you before the break, well, what should the question be then? So I want your thoughts. You reckon that we should have a referendum, or those of you that do, what should that question be on the ballot paper? Toby, you want a referendum. What do you want the question to be?
Well, I've written down, should the UK try to reduce its carbon emissions to net zero by 2050? Yes or no?
But are you going to include... What does that mean? What does it look like? Do you think it should be as binary as that?
Well, I think it's got to be quite short and binary, otherwise the outcome will be
say it again.
unclear. Should the UK try to reduce its carbon emissions to net zero by 2050?
Very straightforward, simple yes or no to that.
OK, if there really were a referendum, then the adult question would be something along the lines that Toby just suggested. But I would put it differently. I would say, do you want to live in warmer homes? And that would mean getting to net zero, because if you want to live in warmer homes, it means insulating your homes, it means working towards the net zero target. A second question would be, do you want to live in a world where you don't get wildfires in London, where the world doesn't burn to a crisp? Because that's what's at stake. And I'll be really honest with both of you, just very quickly.
That sounds slightly one-sided way of putting
it. That's why I said,
that's
why I said in reality, yours would be the question, Toby. But just very quickly, Michelle, because I think this is important. I don't think there should be a referendum. I don't want there to be a referendum. I can buy some of Toby's arguments. I can see the force of it. I don't want there to be a referendum because I worry about what the result would be. Now, you might say that, therefore, you're living in a dictatorship. No, I'm not, because science and our elected politicians are united on this. And I worry that if we had a referendum, people might vote against, and I think that would be disastrous for us and for our children.
So you don't want a referendum in case people don't consent to it?
Correct.
Because you want to impose it on people, whether they consent or not?
Imposed by our elected representatives who've studied the issue and thought about it and who have studied the science.
Do you know, I won't name any names, especially if you're watching, but you say, oh, these elected representatives who've studied all this stuff and all the rest of it. I've had conversations with people in chambers, I don't want to mention any names, where I've been debating an issue and I've called them up and I've said, you know, can you just give me a bit more information? I'm debating this on my show tonight, I've just seen that you guys have had a vote. And the response I've got is, oh, I don't know. I was just told that we had to vote X. So when you have this view in your world that actually all of these elected representatives, they study this information and they avail themselves of their facts and they make these wonderful informed decisions because they are so much brighter than us plebs on the street.
They're not much brighter.
I dispute that.
Sorry, just to respond to that. In fact, they're not necessarily brighter than us, but they are supposed to, we hope, and it's not perfect because no political system is perfect, no democracy is perfect. You hope that they have taken the time to read the prospective legislation, to affiliate themselves with the science, to understand the science, and the rest of us just don't have that time.
I think, in my experience of meeting parliamentarians, the only really thoughtful ones who bothered to delve into the detail of this issue are climate change net zero sceptics. And it's not true that there's a settled consensus among scientists on this issue. There are plenty of dissenting scientists too. But I think you've got an elevated idea.
It's majority settled. I'm not saying there aren't dissenting voices, and we should probably still hear those dissenting voices, but the overwhelming majority of science suggests that if we don't act and act fast, then life for all of us is going to become much more difficult.
But do you think there's all a little bit of sensation? It's like you're saying there, do you want London to burn down in wildfires?
We had fires this summer, which may have been as a consequence of climate change.
Hang on,
the frequency of fires is increasing.
The word "may" there is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
It is.
Because you're saying these spontaneously combusted kind of fields or whatever. I would suggest that some of these so-called wildfires are indeed started by absolute morons performing moronic behaviour, setting fire to things, chucking away barbecues,
Michelle,
chucking cigarettes here, there and everywhere.
That may very well be the case, but the world is getting warmer. Look at the forest fires in Australia, look at the forest fires in California, look at the forest fires in Greece, but look at, above all, at the charts. Look at the way in which the world is warming and look at the way in which we are pumping more and more gases, greenhouse gases.
Let me just come back on that. I mean, there's been a pause in global warming for more than 10 years. Average global temperatures haven't increased for the past 10 years. So it isn't a linear upward progression. That's a fact, my friend. That's a fact. The average global temperatures, as measured by satellites,
you're sitting here on national TV saying that the world is not getting warmer.
No, I'm saying average global temperatures, as measured by satellites, haven't increased for more than 10 years. In addition, if you look at the records, there isn't actually much evidence that extreme weather events have increased in frequency since 100 years ago. I think that...
When you say there isn't much evidence, what do you mean?
Well, the records are pretty threadbare if you go back further in time, but there are other ways of measuring how often there were floods and fires and so forth, hurricanes, tornadoes.
But why do you answer my question? Do you think the world is getting warmer over the last century?
I do think average global temperatures have increased a little bit over the past century.
And do you think that matters?
But the debate isn't over whether average global temperatures have increased a little bit. It's about what causes it.
And you don't think that we're causing it?
You
think it's coincidence that our greenhouse emissions are soaring and the global temperatures are rising?
I'm not completely persuaded that an increase in carbon emissions is what has caused the small increase in average global temperatures.
But more persuaded than not.
Not persuaded enough to, for instance, have to replace my boiler with a heat pump and pay £13,000 doing it. Not enough to say I can't buy a new petrol car in 2030.
I find it absolutely astonishing, because I am going to call you a hypocrite, Matthew, because you're saying the stakes are so high, London might burn to the ground, your homes... And then you freely admit, and this is the thing that annoys me so much, I have to be honest, everyone, people like you, not just you, but there's a lot of people like you, you say about all this net zero stuff, and then you freely admit, I don't do my own small little bit to help the planet.
OK, listen,
So
my answer to that is simple. I do try a bit, but not hard enough. And yes, therefore, you can call me a hypocrite. But that's calling me a hypocrite might make you feel better, and it might make me feel worse. But it's not going to save the world from climate change.
No, but
I'm irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether I'm a hypocrite or not.
No, the mass collection
I openly said I'm a hypocrite.
But yes, but this is my point. People shouldn't keep demanding and dictating actions of others that they don't even perform themselves. You tell me. Am I being a bit harsh or not? Give me your questions for the referendum. If I get told one more time to go to a break, I'm going to cry, quite frankly. So I do need to go to a break. When I come back, I want to talk to you about private schools. Don't go away.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here. You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
I think I've seen probably quite enough of Matt Hancock to last me a lifetime.
I'll also be getting to know you better, travelling to find out what you think about the politicians who are fighting for your vote.
They've got to get this country back on track.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. only on GB News, on TV, radio and online.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere. Amazing! You see, amazing! You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel. Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful. Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Hello there, welcome back to Dewbs & Co. With me, Michelle Dewberry. Let's talk private schools, shall we? Keir Starmer basically says he'll follow in the footsteps of Jeremy Corbyn when it comes to the pledge to end the charitable status for private schools. Is he right or is he wrong? What he's talking about, by the way, is that you don't have to pay 20% VAT on the fees because essentially these schools have got charitable status. You are involved in schooling yourself. You certainly have been for a while, haven't you? Where do you stand on this?
I think it's a bad idea, and the reason it's a bad idea is because if you remove the charitable status from private schools and increase school fees, that increase in cost will be passed on to parents, and many parents who currently send their kids to private school won't be able to afford to. Where are you going to educate those kids? Well, you're going to have to educate them in the state sector, and that's very, very expensive. At the moment, parents who are opting out of the state sector and sending their kids to private school are saving the state a great deal of money, much more money that the state would be able to claim by way of VAT on their school fees. I mean, I made a rough calculation. There are 615,000 children, roughly, in the UK currently being educated in the private sector. It costs roughly £5,000 to educate a child in the state sector, so that's £3 billion right there. The idea that by reducing the number of kids at private school you'd make savings that Keir Starmer says he wants to spend on catch-up is ludicrous. He'd have to spend it on educating the children who can no longer afford to go to private schools who are opting back into the state system. And what about increasing the size of the school estate to accommodate all those kids? 615,000. Let's say an average of 1,000 kids at each school. That's 615 new schools you'd need. They roughly cost 25 million apiece. That's 15 billion right there. Could the taxpayer afford it? Shouldn't we just be grateful that these parents are paying the tax that they would have to pay if their kids are going to school? I mean, they're helping to hold up the state school system via their taxes, but opting not to use state schools, but instead opting out. We should be grateful instead of trying to penalise them.
Well, we should be saying thank you instead of penalising them, says Toby Young, a man who's done his sums there, everyone. Matthew, where do you stand?
Yeah, I feel quite strongly about this, and I want to come back to it. You say that Toby's done his sums. In our break, and I know that GB News, you really care about facts.
We do.
I did a very quick search, and on Bloomberg, which was a trusted source, it said that the last 8 years, I think to about 2021, were the hottest in history. So I dispute what Toby said before the break, and that's important.
Oh, that's about
science,
climate change.
But on the issue of schools,
right.
it's important because it's facts. On the issue of schools, Toby's very persuasive. And my worry about this is that what seems on the face of it to be absolutely absurd, that we, all of us, are subsidising rich parents to send their children to private schools, that actually the consequences, Toby says, of scrapping that exemption on VAT, of scrapping the charitable status on private schools, the consequence of that may be unintended, and that actually it reduces the overall quality of education because we have to put more money into the state sector.
So what's driving this policy then? Because it was...
Politics. I think it's politics.
Politics
so
of what?
I'll give you an
NB?
example. Not the politics of MB, but the politics of Keir Starmer trying to keep sufficient numbers of his own party on side, to be brutally honest. So last week, as you would have covered if you were here, not on holiday, CBI, he spoke to the CBI. And what did he say there? We need to get a grip on migration. And what do we need to do? We need to train up more British people to do jobs that need to be done. So that was throwing some red meat to the voters. And here, I think, to be honest, he's probably throwing some red meat to Labour Party members who think that private education, and I think this as well, despite, again, you call me a hypocrite, I went to a private school like Toby did, despite, I think, the inherent unfairness of it.
I didn't go to a private school.
Did you not? I thought you were an old Etonian, Toby.
No, I'm not. No, I went to 3 different comprehensives.
Why?
Well, there you are. Isn't it interesting that someone who's state-educated backs private schools and someone who's privately educated backs state schools?
Why did you go to 3? I'm fascinated. I'm being nosy.
Because my parents moved around. It wasn't.
Oh, right. It wasn't because you've been not the same.
I dropped out after the second one. I failed all my O-levels and decided to leave school. But then after a year of doing manual labour, I decided actually maybe school's not so bad and went back.
See, I think a lot of the people that are against private schools are just those that probably couldn't afford to send their child, because I think, if you're honest, I was deeply against private schools, deeply. I was really kind of like, why would you want to single out your child to do this, that and the other? Now that I've got a child and I consider the very simple basics of, do I want my kid educated with, let's just say, 30 other kids, or do I want my kid educated with, say, 8 other kids? I mean, for me, it's an absolute no-brainer. Who would answer that question and say, no, actually, Michelle, I want my kid in a class of 30?
I think it's a classic case of a clash between, as it were, rights. So rich people's, wealthy people's right to send their kids to whichever school they want, and the rights of children to be free from the advantages experienced by their neighbours just because their parents are poorer than their neighbours' parents. Like, it seems to me, just on the most basic level, that when you're a kid, you should have the same advantages as the kid next door, and your parents' wealth should have nothing to do with it.
What do you think to that? I think it sounds lovely in theory. Is that a reality, though, that kids, you should be free of any advantages of your parents? You tell me. Many of you coming back to me with your ideas about this net zero thing. The only question that can be on that sheet is simple. Do you want net zero? Yes or no? You shouldn't get into the complications of the dates, you say. Just keep it simple. James says the question should be, do you even believe in it all? Cool, blimey, you open a can of worms there. Jenny says the question should be, do you want to be cold, careless and eating insects? Cool, blimey, would say yes to that. Look at the time. That's all I do have time for tonight. Thank you so much to my panel. Thank you to you guys at home. It's good to be back. But Nigel Farage is up next. Nigel, good evening. What have you got for us?
Michelle, thank you very much. Robust pragmatism is a new phrase that's appeared in relation to foreign policy. I think it could be a new Conservative Rishi Sunak philosophy across the board. Would it solve the immigration crisis? What happens with splits in the party over wind energy and much else besides? And joining me on Talking Pints tonight, John Bolton. He was, of course, national security boss for Donald Trump, former US ambassador to the UN. We'll be asking him about the upsurge of revolution. Is it a revolution? Is it going to get put down in China? All of that coming up. But first, let's get the all-important weather.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. A big change in our weather is now taking place compared with the often wet and windy but mild weather we've seen during recent weeks and months. Still some showers about, but they'll fade away. And then most places are turning drier over the next few days as high pressure increasingly dominates our forecast. Now, this little weather front clearing the east first thing this evening will bring some further showers across parts of East Anglia and the southeast. A lot of cloud here, and that low cloud will keep temperatures from falling too far overnight, but otherwise clear spells elsewhere across the UK will lead to a widespread frost, -3 or -4 Celsius in places, and some dense fog patches first thing for the likes of the central belt into northwest England, parts of Wales and the southwest.